The floorboard creaked, but they didn't hear. In my own daughter's house, I had learned to be a ghost, moving silently through rooms that should have felt like home but instead felt like a beautifully decorated prison. I was just getting a glass of water, my bare feet padding across the cold hardwood, when their voices slipped from the crack in the study door, like poison seeping through a wound. The lawyer confirmed it, my son-in-law Connor was saying, his tone as casual as if he were discussing weekend plans. With the power of attorney and her showing signs of confusion, tomorrow we'll seize her bank accounts, move everything to the trust. It's for her own good. She can't manage it anymore. I froze in that hallway, the cold from the tile floor seeping up through my bare feet like ice water filling my veins. For her own good. For 20 years since Harold passed, I had managed just fine. I had balanced checkbooks, paid bills, made investments. But in that moment, standing in the darkness of my daughter's hallway, I realized something that changed everything. The greatest threat to my future wasn't a stranger with bad intent, it was my own child. And so If stories like this resonate with you, stories of betrayal that cut deeper than any stranger's crime, stories of survival when your own family becomes the enemy, stories of reclaiming power when everyone assumes you're powerless, please subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, about trust, and about my own strength. What I took wasn't just my freedom. I took back my life. My name is Vivian, and 6 months before that terrible night, I thought I was the luckiest mother alive. My husband Harold had been gone for 2 years. 48 years of marriage ended by a heart attack that took him so suddenly I never got to say goodbye. At 75, I was rattling around in our big colonial house, surrounded by decades of memories but feeling desperately alone for the first time in my adult life. That's when my daughter Brielle called with what seemed like the perfect solution. "Mom," she said, her voice full of what I believed was genuine concern. "Connor and I have been talking. This house is too big for you now, and we worry about you being alone. We just finished the in-law suite above the garage. It's beautiful, completely private, but you'd be close enough that we could help with anything you need." I cried with relief. After months of echoing silence in rooms where Harold and I had raised our family, the idea of being near Brielle and Connor, near my grandchildren when they visited, felt like salvation. They moved me in on a crisp October day, and I remember standing in that lovely suite. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, a view of their garden, thinking that grief had brought us closer together as a family. When Brielle suggested I transfer some money to a joint account for household expenses, it seemed not just reasonable, but generous on my part. "You're not paying rent, Mom," she said, "but we'd love it if you could contribute to groceries and utilities. Maybe $45,000 would cover your share for the first year?" I wrote that check gladly, thinking I was being helpful rather than helpful being taken advantage of. The changes started small. "Mom, let us handle the bills now," Connor would say when mail arrived. "You don't need to worry about this stuff anymore." When I protested that I'd been managing finances perfectly well, Brielle would put her arm around me and say, "Of course you have, but wouldn't it be nice to not have to worry about due dates and balancing checkbooks? Let us take care of you for a change." I should have noticed that their concern always involved removing my responsibilities rather than sharing them. They didn't ask if I wanted help with bills, they announced they would handle them. They didn't suggest I might enjoy not worrying about finances. They decided I was no longer capable of worrying about them effectively. The control tightened like a slow-acting poison, so gradually that I almost didn't notice until it was nearly too late. My car developed mysterious problems that Connor insisted required expensive repairs. "The transmission is slipping, Vivian," he would tell me with the authority of someone who knew about such things. "It's not safe for you to drive until we can get it fixed." But somehow, those repairs never quite got scheduled, and my car sat in their driveway collecting leaves, while I became dependent on them for every trip to the grocery store, every doctor's appointment, every journey beyond their property. As my mail started arriving, opened. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. Brielle would say, handing me letters that had clearly been steamed open and resealed. I was expecting a package and grabbed everything from the mailbox by mistake. You know how scattered I get when I'm rushing. It happened once, then twice, then so regularly that I realized my financial statements, medical bills, and correspondence were being screened before they reached my hands. My doctor appointments began getting rescheduled for convenience. Dr. Patterson, who I'd been seeing for 15 years, suddenly became unavailable for the appointments I made myself. Instead, Brielle would announce that she'd found me a new doctor who was much closer to the house and specialized in senior care. When I protested that I liked Dr. Patterson and saw no reason to change, Connor would shake his head sadly and say, "Vivian, Dr. Patterson is concerned about your memory. He thinks you'd benefit from someone who understands age changes better." The financial isolation was the most insidious. "Mom, you're on too many accounts," Connor would explain, spreading bank statements across their kitchen table like evidence in a trial. "Look at this: checking, savings, money market, CDs, investment accounts. It's confusing even for me to keep track of. Why don't we simplify things? Consolidate everything into accounts that Brielle and I can help you monitor." My friendships became another casualty of their concern. "Your friends are so far away now, Mom," Brielle would sigh when Ruth or Betty called to invite me to lunch or bridge club. "Why don't you focus on making friends here in the neighborhood? There are lots of lovely people your age right in our area." But somehow, those neighborhood introductions never materialized, and my old friends gradually stopped calling when I repeatedly had to decline their invitations because Connor's car wasn't available or Brielle was too busy to drive me. The most devastating part wasn't what they were doing to me, it was what I was doing to myself. Every time I felt a flash of irritation or independence, I would immediately feel guilty. These were busy people with demanding careers and their own families to manage. They had opened their home to me, were taking care of practical matters I'd been handling alone since Harold's death, were trying to protect me from the complexity of modern life that seemed to overwhelm so many elderly people. When I felt frustrated about not having access to my car, I told myself that maybe my reflexes weren't what they used to be. When I felt violated by opened mail, I reminded myself that Brielle was just trying to help organize my affairs. When I missed my friends, I convinced myself that maybe it was time to form new relationships closer to my new home. I was doing their work for them, convincing myself that my instincts were wrong and their control was care. But late at night, lying in that beautiful suite that was beginning to feel more like a luxurious cell, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder when I had become so helpless. When had I stopped making my own decisions? When had my opinions about my own life become suggestions that could be overruled by people who knew better? I would feel my heart racing with something between panic and rage, but by morning, surrounded by Brielle's cheerful chatter and Connor's reasonable explanations, those feelings would seem like the paranoid fantasies of an old woman who was probably getting confused by the natural changes of aging. It was 2:30 in the morning, on November 15th, the second anniversary of Harold's death. I couldn't sleep. Hadn't been able to sleep properly since moving into their house, though I'd blamed it on grief and adjustment to new surroundings. The digital clock beside my bed cast its green glow across the ceiling, and I lay there thinking about Harold, about the life we'd built together, about how different everything felt now. My mouth was dry, so I decided to get a glass of water from the kitchen. I had learned to move quietly through their house, not because anyone had asked me to, but because I had somehow absorbed the message that my presence was something to be managed rather than welcomed. I padded barefoot down the hallway, my feet silent on the hardwood floors that Brielle was so proud of. That's when I heard voices coming from Connor's study. Hushed but not quite whispered, the tone of people who believe they're having a private conversation. The door was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of lamplight spill into the dark hallway, and their voices carried clearly through that gap. "The lawyer confirmed it today," Connor was saying, and I could hear papers rustling as if he were reviewing documents. "With the power of attorney documents and the medical records showing her increasing confusion and memory problems, we can expedite the whole process. Dr. Hawkins was very helpful in documenting her cognitive decline." Brielle's voice joined his, and the casual tone of her response was more chilling than any scream could have been. Perfect. Tomorrow morning, we transfer everything to the trust. The bank manager said that with the power of attorney, we can move all her accounts, checking, savings, the CDs, everything. It's for her protection, really. She obviously can't manage her finances anymore. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was afraid they would hear it. Cognitive decline? Memory problems? I had no idea what medical records they were discussing, but I knew with absolute certainty that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Dr. Hawkins, the new doctor they'd insisted I see instead of Dr. Patterson, had apparently been documenting problems that didn't exist. The timing is perfect, Connor continued. She's isolated now, no car, limited contact with her old friends. If she tries to contest anything later, who's going to believe her over documented medical evidence and our testimony about her declining competence? We've been careful to establish the pattern. My bare feet felt frozen to that hardwood floor, as if the cold was seeping up from the earth itself and turning my blood to ice water. The pattern. They hadn't been gradually taking control of my life out of concern. They had been systematically building a case for my incompetence while stealing my autonomy piece by piece. In that moment, standing in the darkness of what I had thought was a loving daughter's home, I understood that everything I had attributed to care was actually strategy. Every kindness was manipulation. Every protection was actually imprisonment. Tomorrow morning, they planned to seize control of everything Harold and I had worked 48 years to build. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that the old woman they were stealing from was the same helpless victim they had been creating through months of systematic isolation and gaslighting. What they didn't realize was that underneath all their careful conditioning, I was still the woman who had co-built a successful life with Harold, who had raised children and managed a household and made tough decisions for 7.5 decades. And that woman had just learned she was at war with her own family. Tomorrow morning, they expected to find a confused, compliant elderly woman ready to sign whatever papers they put in front of her. Instead, they were going to discover that their victim had disappeared in the night, taking with her not just the element of surprise, but everything they thought they already owned. I stood in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to them discuss the details of my financial execution with the same casual efficiency they might use to plan a vacation. When I finally heard chairs scraping and their voices moving toward the staircase, I slipped back to my suite like a shadow, my heart pounding, but my mind crystallizing into the sharpest clarity I'd felt in months. Sitting on the edge of my bed in the darkness, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my situation had been a carefully constructed illusion. I wasn't a beloved mother being cared for by devoted children. I was a mark being set up by skilled con artists who happened to share my DNA. The grief and confusion I'd been attributing to Harold's death hadn't been natural healing. It had been deliberately induced helplessness, designed to make me compliant. But if they could plan my destruction with methodical precision, I could plan my escape the same way. I didn't have much time they intended to strike in the morning, but I had advantages they didn't know about. 48 years of marriage to Harold had taught me to prepare for emergencies, and 2 years of widowhood had taught me to be self-reliant in ways I'd never needed to be when he was alive. I moved through my suite like a woman preparing for surgery, every action deliberate and essential. I didn't pack a suitcase. Suitcases are for trips you want people to know you're taking. Instead, I packed what Harold used to call a go bag, using my everyday purse and a canvas shopping bag that would look innocent if anyone saw me carrying them to my car, if I still had access to my car. First, I gathered my identity documents: passport, birth certificate, social security card, and driver's license. These were the papers that proved I existed as an independent person, and I knew they would try to control these next. From Harold's old desk, I retrieved our marriage certificate and his death certificate, documents that established my legal right to the assets they planned to steal. The most crucial item was something they didn't even know existed: a USB drive Harold had insisted I prepare after his first heart attack 3 years earlier. "Vivian," he had said, "if something happens to me, You're going to need records that prove what we own and where it's located. Don't rely on paper files. Computers crash, houses burn, but a backup drive can fit in your pocket. That drive contained copies of every bank statement, investment record, insurance policy, and legal document related to our finances. The hardest part was choosing what to leave behind. I looked at the jewelry Harold had given me over the decades, my engagement ring, anniversary necklaces, the pearl earrings he bought me for our silver wedding anniversary. Taking them would signal that I was gone for good and might make Brielle and Connor realize how much I had overheard. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that my real wealth wasn't in objects they could steal, but in knowledge they couldn't take. The most important thing I took was something they couldn't possibly know about, a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Harold and I had opened that box 20 years earlier as what he called our nuclear option, a place to keep documents and resources that would be available even if everything else went wrong. I hadn't opened it since Harold's funeral, but I knew it contained original signature cards for accounts, legal documents, and emergency cash. By 3:30 IMM, my go bag was ready. Everything fit into my regular purse and the canvas shopping bag. Nothing that would look unusual if someone saw me. I dressed in comfortable clothes and sturdy shoes, layers that would keep me warm but wouldn't look like I was dressed for traveling. I wanted to look like a grandmother going to the grocery store, not a woman fleeing in the night. The hardest moment was leaving Harold's picture on my nightstand. For 2 years, I had said goodnight to that photo every evening, and leaving it felt like abandoning him all over again. But as I stood at my door, looking back at the suite that had been both sanctuary and prison, I heard Harold's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me. "Go, Vivian. Show them what we're made of." At 4:15 a.m., I made the most terrifying phone call of my life. My hands were shaking as I opened the rideshare app on the phone Connor had insisted I needed for safety, one of the few pieces of technology they'd encouraged me to use because they thought it would make me more dependent rather than more free. The irony wasn't lost on me as I requested a pickup from the corner store 3 blocks away instead of directly from their house. I slipped out through the back door of the suite, the same door I'd used for garden walks that Brielle always praised as so good for your health, Mom. My footsteps on the gravel driveway sounded impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence, and every shadow seemed like it might be Connor or Brielle discovering my escape. But the main house remained dark, and I made it to the street without triggering any lights or setting off their dogs barking. The 3-block walk to the corner store felt like the longest journey of my life. Every car that passed made me freeze, expecting to see Connor's headlights or hear Brielle calling my name. But at 4:30 a.m., the suburban streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck or shift worker heading home. When I saw the rideshare car waiting under the store's parking lot lights, I nearly cried with relief. The driver was a young woman named Ruby, who looked tired but kind. "Early doctor appointment?" she asked as I settled into the back seat, probably wondering why a grandmother was traveling alone at dawn. "Something like that," I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. I was indeed seeking treatment, though not the medical kind. She didn't press for details, instead offering me a bottle of water and asking if the temperature in the car was comfortable. I didn't ask Ruby to take me to a hotel or a friend's house. Those would be the first places Brielle and Connor would look when they discovered my absence. Instead, I directed her to Rosie's All-Night Cafe in the next town over, a 24-hour diner I remembered from road trips with Harold. It was the kind of anonymous, ordinary place where an elderly woman sitting alone with a cup of coffee wouldn't attract attention or be remembered clearly. When Ruby drove away and I walked into that fluorescent-lit diner at 5:15 a.m., something extraordinary happened. My hands, which had been trembling with fear for hours, suddenly became steady. My breathing, which had been shallow and panicked, deepened into something calmer. For the first time in months, I was exactly where I chose to be, making decisions based on my own judgment rather than someone else's concern for my well-being. I ordered coffee, black, the way I'd always preferred it before Brielle started insisting that cream would be gentler on my stomach. I sat in a corner booth where I could see both the entrance and the back exit, a precaution Harold had taught me years ago, without either of us imagining I'd ever need to use it. And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I made my own plan based on my own priorities. Using a pen from my purse and napkins from the table dispenser, I began making lists. Not the vague, hopeful lists of someone who didn't understand their situation, but the detailed strategic planning of someone who finally grasped the scope of the war being waged against them. People to call, accounts to secure, evidence to gather, legal protections to establish. My first call wasn't to a friend or family member who might try to talk me into working things out or giving them the benefit of the doubt. At 6:00 a.m., I called the 24-hour fraud prevention line at my bank, the number printed on the back of every debit card but used by very few customers who aren't facing genuine emergencies. "This is Vivian Morrison," I told the fraud specialist who answered on the second ring. "I have reason to believe there will be an attempt today to fraudulently obtain power of attorney over my accounts and assets. I need to speak with someone immediately about protecting my financial security from what I believe is elder abuse being perpetrated by family members." The specialist's tone changed immediately from routine politeness to professional concern. This wasn't a confused elderly person making paranoid accusations. This was a woman with specific information about a specific threat who was taking proactive steps to protect herself. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "let me transfer you to our Elder Protection Unit immediately. We take these situations very seriously." Sitting in that diner booth at dawn, speaking clearly and competently to a bank official who is treating me like an intelligent adult rather than a confused child, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The return of my own power. Not power over other people, but power over my own life, my own choices, my own future. Brielle and Connor thought they would wake up that morning to find a helpless old woman ready to sign whatever documents they put in front of her. Instead, they were going to discover that their victim had vanished in the night, taking with her not just the element of surprise, but also the financial access they had been so confident was already theirs. The war they had started while I was grieving and vulnerable was about to become a fair fight, and they had no idea what they were actually fighting. At 8:30 a.m., after 3 hours of strategic planning in that diner booth and 2 more cups of coffee that tasted like freedom, I took a taxi to First National Bank downtown. The safety deposit box key felt warm in my palm, not from body heat but from the weight of secrets I was about to uncover. Harold had always been a planner, but I had no idea how thoroughly he had prepared for the possibility that someone might try to steal from me after his death. The bank manager, Mrs. Patterson, no relation to my old doctor, greeted me with professional courtesy, tinged with curiosity. It wasn't unusual for elderly customers to access safety deposit boxes, but it was unusual for them to arrive alone at opening time with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, reviewing my identification carefully, "I see this box hasn't been opened since your husband's funeral. Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be," I replied, which was both completely honest and utterly incomprehensible to anyone who didn't know what I'd discovered the night before. She led me to the vault, and when that metal door swung open, I found myself looking at Harold's final gift to me. One he'd prepared years earlier, but never told me about in detail. The first thing I found was a manila envelope marked, "For Vivian, if anyone ever questions your competence." Inside were original signature cards for every bank account we'd ever opened, dating back to our first joint checking account in 1974. But more importantly, there was a notarized letter from Harold's estate attorney, dated just 6 months before Harold's death, explicitly stating that I was of completely sound mind and should maintain sole control over all marital assets. Harold had anticipated this exact situation. The letter detailed his concerns that certain family members might attempt to gain control over Vivian's finances by questioning her mental competence after my death. It included the attorney's professional assessment of my sharp intellect, excellent memory, and sound financial judgment, along with his recommendation that I be considered the sole decision-maker for all financial matters. But Harold's preparation went even deeper. The box contained photocopies of original financial documents that proved the true ownership and history of our accounts. Documents that Brielle and Connor couldn't possibly have accessed or altered. Bank statements going back decades, investment records, insurance policies, even receipts for major purchases, all meticulously organized and labeled in Harold's careful handwriting. The smoking gun was a document I'd forgotten we'd ever signed. A revocable trust agreement that Harold and I had created 15 years earlier with a different attorney, not the one Brielle and Connor were apparently working with now. According to this trust, any attempt to have me declared incompetent would require evaluations from 2 independent physicians who had been treating me for at least 6 months, plus a formal court hearing with legal representation of my choosing. At the bottom of the box was an envelope marked "My Darling Vivian" in Harold's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated the day before his fatal heart attack. A letter I never knew existed. "If you're reading this," it began, "then someone is trying to steal what we built together, and you're fighting back the way I knew you would. You are stronger than you know, smarter than they think, and more prepared than they could imagine. I've watched you handle every challenge our marriage faced with grace and determination. The woman who raised our children, managed our household, and built our life alongside me doesn't become helpless just because I'm gone. Trust your instincts, use these documents, and remember, anyone who tries to convince you that you're incompetent is telling you more about their own character than yours." Sitting in that bank vault, surrounded by evidence of Harold's faith in my strength and his preparation for this battle, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for my financial security. I was honoring the trust of a man who had spent 48 years believing in my competence, even when I sometimes doubted it myself. By 10 o'clock IE evening, I was sitting across from the bank's fraud prevention specialist, Mrs. Chen, spreading Harold's documents across her desk like a general deploying battle plans. The transformation in how I was treated was immediate and complete. This wasn't a confused elderly woman making vague accusations. This was a competent adult with documented evidence of attempted financial exploitation. "Mrs. Morrison," Mrs. Chen said, reviewing the power of attorney documents I'd photographed with my phone the night before, "these papers your family plans to use have serious legal problems. The medical evaluations they're based on were conducted by a physician you'd only seen twice, and there's no evidence of the extended observation period required by state law for competency determinations. Within 2 hours, every account Harold and I had ever opened was flagged with fraud alerts. Any attempt to access them would trigger immediate investigation and require not just my presence, but independent verification of my mental competence from physicians of my choosing. The joint account I'd contributed to the $45,000, 0 cents Brielle and Connor, thought was their first step toward controlling my finances, was frozen pending investigation of unauthorized transactions. That's when we discovered they had already started stealing from me. The bank records showed $12,000, 0 cents, in transfers from the joint account to accounts in Connor's name. Transfers made without my knowledge or consent over the past 3 months. Mrs. Chen's expression grew grimmer as she reviewed the transaction history. "This is a clear pattern of financial exploitation," Mrs. Chen said, printing out transaction records that showed systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. Pool maintenance, $3,200, 0 cents. Home security system, $2,800, 0 cents. Landscaping, $4,100, 0 cents. Car repairs, $1,900, 0 cents. These are all charges that should have been discussed with you as the account holder. But securing my existing accounts was only the first step. Mrs. Chen helped me open new accounts at a different bank entirely, accounts that Brielle and Connor would have no knowledge of and no possible access to. These weren't just checking and savings accounts, but investment accounts, and a trust structure that would protect my assets even if someone did eventually succeed in having me declared incompetent. Mrs. Chen also connected me with the bank's elder law specialist, who immediately scheduled an appointment with an independent physician for a comprehensive competency evaluation. "Mrs. Morrison," she explained, "you want to establish a current professional assessment of your mental state before anyone can claim your competence has declined since your husband's death." By 2:00 p.m., I had also retained a lawyer, not a family attorney who might try to mediate or encourage reconciliation, but Patricia Kellerman, a specialist in elder abuse cases who had a reputation for aggressive prosecution of financial exploitation. Patricia's first action was to send cease and desist letters to both Brielle and Connor, informing them that any attempt to access my financial accounts or represent themselves as my legal representatives would result in immediate criminal charges. "The beauty of their plan," Patricia explained, "is that it's also the evidence of their crime. If they proceed with trying to use those power of attorney documents tomorrow, they'll be committing fraud in writing with multiple witnesses. We don't have to prove they intended to steal from you, we just have to let them try." But the most powerful moment came when Patricia asked me a simple question. "Mrs. Morrison, do you want to prosecute this criminally, or would you prefer to handle it as a family matter?" The question crystallized everything I'd been feeling since that terrible moment in the hallway. They stopped being family the moment they decided I was an obstacle instead of their mother, I replied. "I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, not just to protect myself, but to protect every other elderly person whose children might be watching to see whether this kind of betrayal has consequences." By 5:00 p.m. that day, I had transformed from a victim being led to financial slaughter into a fortress they couldn't penetrate. Every account secured, every document protected, every legal protection activated. Harold's preparation had given me the weapons, but my own fury had given me the will to use them. Brielle and Connor thought they would wake up the next morning to execute a plan months in the making. Instead, they were going to discover that their victim had spent 18 hours building a legal and financial wall around herself that would not just stop their theft, but provide evidence for their prosecution. They had declared war on someone they thought was helpless. They were about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one who has nothing left to lose and every reason to fight back with everything they have. By the second day of what I now think of as my financial war of independence, I realized that everything Brielle and Connor had taught me about dependence was exactly backward. They had convinced me that needing help meant surrendering control, that asking for assistance meant admitting incompetence. What I discovered was that the smartest people don't try to handle complex situations alone. They build teams of professionals who are legally bound to act in their best interests. My first call was to the National Elder Abuse Hotline, a resource I'd never heard of until Mrs. Chen mentioned it. The counselor who answered, Rebecca Martinez, didn't just listen to my story, she understood it in ways that family members never could. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, "what you're describing is textbook financial exploitation with psychological manipulation. The good news is that you recognized it early and took protective action. The challenging news is that family-based elder abuse is often the most difficult to prosecute because juries want to believe families have good intentions." Rebecca connected me with Patricia Hensley, a professional fiduciary who specialized in cases where family members had proven untrustworthy. A fiduciary isn't just someone who manages your money, it's someone who is legally required to put your interests first, who faces criminal penalties if they betray your trust, who must document every decision and be accountable to both you and the court system. "Mrs. Morrison," Patricia explained during our first meeting, "my job is to protect your autonomy, not to replace your decision-making. I will never tell you what to do with your money or your life. I will provide you with information, options, and professional recommendations, but the choices remain entirely yours." After months of being told what I could and couldn't handle, hearing someone acknowledge my right to make my own decisions nearly brought me to tears. Patricia introduced me to Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations for elderly people facing family disputes. Dr. Hartwell's assessment was thorough and professional. Not the rushed, predetermined conclusion I'd apparently received from Dr. Hawkins. but a comprehensive evaluation that took 3 hours and included memory tests, logical reasoning assessments, and financial decision-making scenarios. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Hartwell told me when the evaluation was complete, your cognitive function is well above average for someone of any age, let alone 75. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your understanding of financial concepts is sophisticated. There is absolutely no medical basis for anyone to question your competence to manage your own affairs. But I didn't stop with medical and legal professionals. Through the Elder Abuse Support Network, I connected with other people who had survived financial exploitation by family members. These weren't support groups focused on healing and forgiveness. These were strategic alliances with people who understood that family betrayal required the same response as any other crime: documentation, prosecution, and permanent protection. Martha, a widow whose son had stolen her retirement funds, taught me about financial record-keeping that would be admissible in court. Robert, whose daughter had tried to have him committed to gain control of his estate, showed me how to document every conversation and interaction for legal purposes. These people had learned the hard way that love and trust aren't enough when dealing with family members who see you as a resource rather than a relationship. Within a week, I had assembled what Patricia called a protection team: lawyer, fiduciary, doctor, accountant, and a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. Each person was bound by professional ethics and legal requirements to act in my interest. Unlike family members who could claim their betrayal was motivated by love, these professionals faced real consequences if they failed to protect me. The legal counterattack began on Thursday morning, exactly 4 days after I'd overheard their plan to seize my accounts. Patricia Kellerman had spent those 4 days building what she called an airtight case for financial exploitation and elder abuse. The evidence was overwhelming because Brielle and Connor had been so confident of success that they'd barely bothered to hide their activities. The first document served was a restraining order preventing Brielle and Connor from accessing any of my financial accounts, medical records, or personal property. The second was a cease and desist order demanding they stop representing themselves as my caregivers or legal representatives. The third was a formal complaint to the district attorney's office, charging them with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. But the most devastating blow was the forensic accounting report that my new accountant, Bernard Walsh, had prepared. Bernard had 40 years of experience in financial crime investigation, and he'd found evidence of theft that went back much further than the obvious $12,000.00 from the joint account. Mrs. Morrison, Bernard explained, spreading bank statements and receipts across his conference table, they've been stealing from you systematically for at least 8 months. The joint account transfers are just the most recent. Look at these credit card charges on cards you didn't know existed. Cards they opened using your personal information as an authorized user. The credit card statements showed $8,000.00 in charges for Connor's truck repairs, $3,500.00 for Brielle's shopping sprees, $2,200.00 for restaurant meals I'd never eaten, and $1,800.00 for a weekend getaway they'd taken while I was supposedly too confused to be left alone. They had been financing their lifestyle with my money while planning to steal the rest. Even worse was the medical fraud. Dr. Hawkins, the physician they'd insisted I see instead of Dr. Patterson, had been documenting cognitive decline that didn't exist. His notes described confusion, memory problems, and poor judgment that bore no resemblance to my actual mental state. But the most chilling discovery was that Brielle had been feeding him false information about incidents that had never happened. According to Dr. Hawkins' notes, I had become confused during grocery shopping and left without paying, had forgotten the names of close family members during conversations, and had made several large, inappropriate financial decisions without considering consequences. None of these incidents had ever occurred, but they formed the medical foundation for the power of attorney documents Brielle and Connor planned to use. Sitting in Patricia Kellerman's office, Reviewing the documented evidence of my own family's systematic campaign to destroy my independence and steal my life's work, I experienced something beyond anger or hurt. It was a kind of grief I'd never felt before. Not the grief of losing someone you loved, but the grief of discovering that someone you loved had never actually existed. The Brielle who had called to invite me into her home, who had seemed so concerned about my well-being, who had hugged me and told me she just wanted to take care of me, that person was a fiction. The real Brielle was someone who could look at her grieving mother and see a bank account to be emptied, who could fabricate medical symptoms to build a legal case, who could plan my financial destruction with the same casual efficiency she might use to plan a dinner party. But the medical fraud was the cruelest betrayal of all. They hadn't just been stealing my money, they had been systematically destroying my confidence in my own mind. Every time I felt confused or uncertain about something, I had wondered if it was the beginning of cognitive decline. Every time I couldn't remember a detail or felt overwhelmed by a decision, I had feared that maybe Brielle and Connor were right to be concerned about my mental state. Now I understood that my confusion hadn't been medical, it had been deliberate. They had been moving my belongings and claiming I'd misplaced them. They had been changing plans and telling me I'd forgotten the original arrangements. They had been creating the very symptoms that Dr. Hawkins was documenting, building a false medical history that would justify their theft. The violation wasn't just financial, it was psychological, medical, and emotional. They had been willing to make me doubt my own sanity in order to steal my money. They had been prepared to have me committed to a nursing home where I would have died believing I was losing my mind, never knowing that my confusion had been deliberately manufactured by people who claimed to love me. In that moment of complete understanding, my grief transformed into something much more powerful. Absolute determination to ensure they faced consequences, not just for what they had stolen, but for what they had tried to destroy. They hadn't just attempted to take my money, they had tried to take my identity, my autonomy, my sanity, and my dignity. That kind of betrayal doesn't deserve forgiveness. It deserves justice. And justice was exactly what they were going to receive, whether they understood what they had done or not. 3 weeks after my escape, I signed the lease on a small apartment in Riverside Gardens, a senior living community that was everything Willowbrook Manor wasn't. Instead of institutional care designed to manage elderly people, Riverside offered independent living designed to support active adults who wanted autonomy with optional services. My one-bedroom apartment had a full kitchen, private entrance, and a view of gardens I could tend myself if I chose to. The apartment was small enough to be manageable, but large enough to feel like home rather than a holding cell. I furnished it with pieces I chose myself, not the ornate furniture from the house Harold and I had shared, which carried too many memories, but simple, comfortable pieces that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been. For the first time in months, every object in my living space was there because I had decided it belonged there. But the real transformation wasn't in my surroundings, it was in my daily life. I got a new cell phone with a number that Brielle and Connor didn't know, giving me the precious gift of a telephone that rang only when someone I actually wanted to hear from was calling. I opened a checking account at a local credit union where I was known as Mrs. Morrison, not as someone's confused mother who needed financial supervision. The simplest activities became celebrations of independence, grocery shopping without someone questioning my choices or insisting they knew what I needed better than I did, cooking meals based on what I wanted to eat rather than what someone else thought was appropriate for my age and health, reading books that interested me without anyone suggesting I might find them too challenging or too stimulating before bedtime. But the most transformative change was my volunteer work at the Riverside Animal Shelter. Patricia Hensley had suggested volunteering as a way to rebuild my sense of purpose and connection, but what I found at the shelter was something more profound, a place where my value was measured by what I could contribute rather than what I owned, where my age was seen as wisdom rather than vulnerability. The dogs and cats at the shelter didn't care about my bank balance or wonder whether I was competent to make decisions. They cared whether I was gentle, whether I was patient, whether I showed up consistently to provide the care they needed. Working with frightened animals who had been abandoned or abused, I discovered that my own experience with betrayal had given me a special understanding of how to rebuild trust, slowly and carefully. Within 2 months, I was training other volunteers in animal behavior and trauma recovery. The shelter director, Maria Santos, began consulting with me about difficult cases, animals who had been so badly treated that they couldn't trust humans easily. My age, which Brielle and Connor had treated as a limitation, became an asset in working with creatures who needed the patience and steady presence that comes with decades of life experience. Through the shelter, I met other volunteers who became genuine friends, people who appreciated my company rather than tolerating my presence, who invited me to activities because they enjoyed my participation rather than because they felt obligated to include me. Ruth, a retired teacher, introduced me to her book club. Frank, a widowed veteran, invited me to join his gardening group. These weren't relationships based on dependency or obligation, but on mutual interest and respect. The legal proceedings took 8 months to conclude, during which Brielle and Connor discovered that crime has consequences even when the victims are your own family members. Patricia Kellerman prosecuted the case with the thoroughness of someone who understood that elder abuse often goes unpunished because families pressure victims to work things out rather than demanding justice. Connor pled guilty to financial exploitation and fraud, accepting a sentence of 2 years probation and full restitution rather than risk a jury trial. Brielle fought the charges initially, apparently believing that her status as my daughter would somehow excuse her behavior, but eventually accepted a plea bargain when faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of jail time. The restitution order required them to repay not just the money they had stolen, but also legal fees, forensic accounting costs, and penalties for financial exploitation. The total came to $47,000, significantly more than the $25,000 they had actually taken. But Patricia explained that financial crimes carry additional penalties designed to discourage others from attempting similar theft. The emails started arriving about 2 months into the legal proceedings, sent through Connor's work account since their personal communications were restricted by the restraining order. These weren't apologies for what they had done. They were complaints about the consequences they were facing, framed as appeals to family loyalty and guilt, designed to make me feel responsible for their problems. "Mom," one email began, "we understand you're angry about the money, but surely you don't want to see your own daughter facing criminal charges over what was essentially a misunderstanding about financial management. Connor's job is in jeopardy because of the background check issues, and we might lose our house if this continues. Think about what Dad would have wanted. Would he really want our family destroyed over money?" Another message tried a different approach. "The legal fees are destroying us financially, and the stress is affecting our health. Connor has developed high blood pressure, and I've been having panic attacks. Is this really worth it? We made mistakes, but we're family. Can't we work this out without involving strangers in our private business?" I didn't respond to any of these messages, not because I was cruel, but because responding would have suggested that their consequences were my responsibility rather than the natural result of their crimes. They kept framing their theft as a misunderstanding and their prosecution as my choice to destroy the family, never acknowledging that they had destroyed our family relationship the moment they decided to steal from me while planning to have me declared incompetent. What struck me most about their appeals was how they still didn't grasp what they had actually done. They focused entirely on the money, the amounts stolen, the restitution owed, the legal costs incurred, but never mentioned the medical fraud, the psychological manipulation, or the plan to have me committed. They seemed genuinely unable to understand that the financial theft was only part of a much larger betrayal that had targeted my autonomy, my dignity, and my sanity. The restraining order was scheduled to expire after 2 years, but I chose to make it permanent, not out of fear that they would physically harm me, but out of recognition that people who could plan and execute such a comprehensive betrayal were not people I wanted in my life under any circumstances. Some relationships can't be repaired because they were never actually based on mutual respect to begin with. 2 years later, sitting in my comfortable apartment with my rescue dog Lucy sleeping at my feet and my volunteer schedule for the animal shelter spread across my kitchen table, I can honestly say that being betrayed by my own family was both the most devastating and the most liberating experience of my life. Devastating because it forced me to acknowledge that the people I had trusted most in the world saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. Liberating because surviving their betrayal taught me that I was far stronger, smarter, and more capable than I had ever imagined. The life I've built since my escape isn't perfect, but it's mine. Every decision I make, from what to have for breakfast to how to spend my afternoons, is based on my own judgment rather than someone else's idea of what's appropriate for a woman my age. Every relationship I maintain is voluntary rather than obligatory, based on mutual enjoyment rather than family duty or caregiver necessity. If you're watching this and recognizing elements of your own family situation, if people who claim to care about you are making decisions about your life without your input, if your mail is being opened or your phone calls monitored, if you're being told you're too confused to handle things you've managed successfully for decades, I want you to understand something crucial. Your instincts are probably correct, and you have more power than they want you to realize. Age doesn't make you incompetent, it makes you experienced. Needing help with some things doesn't mean you're helpless with everything. Trusting family members doesn't make you naive, it makes you decent. And when that trust is betrayed, your response doesn't have to be acceptance or forgiveness. It can be protection, prosecution, and the beginning of a new life where such betrayal can't reach you. The people who try to control you often reveal more about their own limitations than about yours. Brielle and Connor saw an elderly widow and assumed she was helpless. What they were actually looking at was someone with 75 years of life experience, professional relationships they didn't know about, financial resources they hadn't discovered, and the accumulated wisdom that comes from surviving decades of challenges they couldn't imagine. Your age is not a disability. It's an accumulation of knowledge, skills, and judgment that younger people haven't had time to develop. Your need for assistance in some areas doesn't invalidate your competence in others. Your willingness to trust doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you human. And when that humanity is exploited, your response can be as strategic and decisive as any response you've ever made to a threat. They thought I was a bank account with legs, an inheritance delayed by an inconvenient heartbeat. What I actually was, what I had always been, was the author of my own story, the architect of my own choices, and the guardian of my own legacy. They weren't just stealing my money, they were trying to steal my ending. And I refuse to let that happen. You are never too old to rewrite your story. Your dignity belongs to you, not to people who think your age makes you disposable. Your money belongs to you, not to people who think your family relationship gives them claim to your assets. Your future belongs to you, not to people who assume you don't have enough time left for it to matter. If stories like this inspire you, stories of people who refuse to accept other people's definitions of their limitations, who fought back against betrayal with intelligence and strategic planning, who discovered that being underestimated can become your greatest weapon, please subscribe to this channel. I share these experiences not to frighten you, but to demonstrate that survival is possible and that justice, while sometimes slow, is achievable. Share your own stories in the comments below. I want to hear about times when you surprised people with your strength, when you turned other people's low expectations into your strategic advantage, when you discovered you were more capable than anyone realized. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage to fight back. Remember, they can attempt to seize your accounts, but they can never seize your spirit. They can try to control your money, but they can't control your mind. They can steal your assets, but they can't steal your dignity. Unless you let them. And you don't have to let them.